Good evening. I'm LA Steele. Tonight's show, I'm going to take a little liberty here and do some self-promotion. I wanted to everybody to take note of the blogtalkradio.com/LA Steele Show org, which is at the bottom of your screen. That is my new internet radio show, and Lila and I, who's my co-host, is on. We're on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday night at 8 p.m., 8 to 9 o'clock. And we also have our traditional radio show we've been doing for 4 years on Q103.3 FM in Lakeville, Connecticut. And I wanted to, tonight's show is based on a concept that I've been struggling with for the last year. And it's essentially, I've been trying to understand the words of Muhammad through the Quran, and trying to get some essential idea of why Christianity, or at least the West, is so opposed to the teachings, and what's wrong with these teachings of Islam, and why are we so frightened by them, and why are soldiers and interrogators flushing Qurans down the toilet and trying to get people to convert to Christianity, and you have all these wingnut Christians running around going, "Oh, Islam's going to destroy the world," and it's come to my mind, and I've seen it over the years through many other things that we've gone insane over and had as a society, but this fear is steeped in a tremendous lie and in a tremendous ignorance, okay, of the Western culture, and a tremendous media blitz, all right, against the Islamic culture and the faith of Islam. And I've known several Muslims in my life, and haven't quite seen any of these traits that people so seem to want to extend to them. And a wonderful gentleman named Dr. Khaseem Khaleel has been on my radio show a number of times, and we've had our interviews with him. And he's come out with several fascinating books, and one is The Words of Mahummad. I'm going to lift that up here right this minute and show it to you. But this particular book is a marvelous translation and breakdown of what the Islam and what Muhammad is and who he is and what the culture really is. And it's a wonderful statement, and it's highly recommended to my viewers and to my listeners. And you can hear an interview with him, a recent interview that we did with him on blogtalkradio.com/LASteelshow.org. It's not dot, I'm sorry, it's LASteelshow.org. And if you want to go to our website, it's LASteelshow.org. Just go to our link section, go to the first link, and that'll put you right there as well, to our host page. And check out our archives. And you'll see this particular interview with Dr. K. My essay tonight, the way I wanted to start the show is, got a tremendous number of visits and hits on my website when I published this about a month ago. And I'd like to read it tonight. It's called "The War Against Islam is War Against Ourselves." I have heard many statements made about followers of Islam from the media and from other ignorant or propaganda-filled sources. I have heard these same disturbing statements made about people of different races, people of different languages, different sizes and weights and income status. Are we, as the human species, so full of hate and rage, fueled by groveling ignorance, that we cannot raise our heads out of the excrement of our most base selves? Are we so lowly a species that we compare with the most predatory creatures? These creatures operate on instinct and act or react for territorial self-preservation. If animals know hatred, it is because man has taught it to them. In my recent research of Islamic culture, I have been trying to identify the main themes and comparisons between Western and Middle Eastern cultures and formulate an understanding of both, so I can convey the findings to my audiences. The rise of hatred and war amongst these opposing societies and cultures warrants serious questioning on behalf of the thinking members of those societies as to what is fueling the conflict. I will not give any note of specific recognition as to where I have seen the images I am about to mention, other than they are attributed to pro-Israel and pro-Christian websites. I have seen them, and I was reviled and disgusted by them. Many of these images were degrading images of Jesus and Muhammad. These images were from medieval and modern artists and defiled both prophets in the most vile and contemptible depictions. Many of these pictures and comments were from famous museums, manuscripts, and mainstream European and American publications. Soulless promoters of highly profane renditions of the world's greatest prophets convinced me of the depravity of men and women throughout the centuries. This depravity is fueled to a great degree by our own spiritual and political leaders. For me to be shocked by the depravity of humanity, as a man of my age and experience, is rather a rare occurrence. However, in recent years, with the advent of the Iraq War and the atrocities of the Israeli Zionist occupation and war with Palestine and Lebanon, and the publicized revelations of the heinous crimes and deaths and torture conducted by both cultures against one another, I can state with confidence that very little else can shock me. In the Quran, it states that both Jesus and Muhammad will sit in judgment of the world in the end times. The Mahdi of Islamic prophecy is the perfect spiritual man who will come to raise Islam in the final days. In Christianity is Jesus, who will return to earth to rule. Each prophecy resembles the other. Even the physical description of the Mahdi states that he will resemble Jesus and be of the Arabic race. I have not found clarity yet for a compromise between both faiths, other than both religions, both prophets were messengers to humanity from the exact same God. Both prophets credited the Father, the one God, the God of Abraham and Isaac. Both prophets claim their God to be the same God of the Jews. What Islam does is condemn the Jews and Christians for their hypocrisy, as well as their unwarranted aggression against Islamic people. The power and message of condemnation is granted to them based upon the message Muhammad received from God's messenger, the angel Gabriel. The same angel who visited Mary, the mother of Jesus, and told her she would give birth to the Messiah. The Quran recognizes Mary as the mother of Jesus, the Messiah, and the chosen apostle of God, but it also claims Muhammad as the last prophet of the same God. Who am I? Who is anyone to deny that Muhammad was a prophet? Who is anyone to deny Jesus as a prophet? Almost half the world's population believes in one or the other men as being prophets. What most fail to understand is that both prophets claim their divine messages from the exact same God. There is no difference between them except 600 years of cultural changes, 600 years of corrupted Christian and pagan values conceived and revised under Roman domination and coerced upon the known civilizations by the Church of Rome. Is it too difficult to imagine that God might have been disappointed with the political aspirations, corruption, and incompetence of the early church leaders? According to the Quran, God was disappointed enough that he sent the angel Gabriel to speak to Muhammad, another prophet, to try and straighten out the mess that was created. He instructed Muhammad to accept the message of Jesus and spread the teachings, and created the new laws for the people of the desert regions, and to spread the truth to the world. Christianity, as the world knows it, was greatly inspired by the works of Paul of Tarsus. Why do Christian believers believe so devoutly in Paul's conversion experience and not believe that Muhammad had a similar experience? How can they believe that Gabriel visited Mary and not believe that he visited Muhammad 600 years later? The same factual empirical evidence of either visitation is the same. Neither had witnesses. Both instances were self-proclaimed and later believed by family members and followers. To deny one or the other is based solely on the politics and propaganda of political and religious leadership of the times. The new rise of jihad is inflamed by the insane foreign policies of the Bush administration and the global interests he is fronting for. The hatred of the Christians, Jews, and Muslims is created by the imperial aggression of the leaders of the Western countries allied with Israel to plunder the oil wealth of the Middle East. This is obvious except to the most blind and ignorant. It must be understood that actions of Muhammad must be placed in the context of the times he lived in and the region of the world. This was a war-filled world with conquering tribes and organized bands of lawless marauders that pillaged villages and settlements and terrorized populations. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Peace came from military victory and brutal enforcement of regional laws. It was the same in Europe during the Dark Ages. These were feudal times when paganism and polytheism still flourished throughout the world. Monotheism was a new concept, a new idea that had begun to capture mankind's imagination. The grand concepts of compassion, mercy, love, forgiveness of one's enemies, love for one's neighbors, heaven and earth, and the end of man's suffering, or an eternity of suffering, these were great and new concepts that swept through the world on the words of the prophets. Grand visions and ideologies communicated to men and women without the aid of mass communications, without the aid of computers or telecommunications, without the combustion engine or steam power, and limited written communications. All was transmitted verbally from teacher to student, from apostle to priest, from priest and political leaders to the general public. It is miraculous that the words and visions of Jesus and Muhammad had survived 2 millenniums. The possibility that deliberate or innocent misinterpretations derived from poor translations of the words of the prophets might have skewed some of the true message is highly probable. In fact, it's highly improbable that the perfect message of God to man hasn't been garbled in translations and used as it is today for political manipulation of the masses. Many skeptics believe that religions were designed by the ruling elite for population control, used to incite populations to enter into war or create fear of the afterlife, so their subjects willingly pay tithings to the king or government-controlled church. We cannot underestimate the powers of the ruling elite in any society to pursue covetously any means of controlling their societies or gaining control of more people and resources to enrich their societies. This has to be understood for anyone to grasp the complexities of our most recent struggles between cultures. The use of religious and racial hatred to inspire people to war is an ancient and extremely effective tool, used by rulers since the first civilizations. It creates a false belief that one race or one religion is superior to another, manipulating the words of the prophets to confuse and control the masses of devout believers. The Christian leaders are as guilty of using this tactic as are the Muslims, as are any religious leaders in the world, past or present. The only way that an individual can ever discern or identify the meaning of a God's message is by true and honest reflection of God's message, as it is spoken directly to ourselves. We cannot fully trust that the words of the prophets of any faith have been accurately translated and passed down from generation to generation without either some major or minor alteration. Just as every constitutional government has had to amend its constitution to include or clarify a certain issue that could not have been imagined by its original writers and definitely not comprehended by those it has meant to govern, how could any mortal man or woman have seen 2,000 years into the future and described their vision effectively to their own generation and hope it is cherished and preserved by the countless generations of the future? Yes, I believe that these immortal words of the Christian and Islamic holy books were divinely inspired. I believe that the courage and faith of those who spread and preserved the words of the prophets were divinely inspired, as evidenced by their suffering and dying for their beliefs. Must the martyrs of Islam be considered any less courageous or less devout than the martyrs of Christianity? Who judges these people who give their lives for their faith in God, who give their lives for their faith in the eternal salvation and earthly betterment of mankind, shed their blood, sacrifice their families, die agonizing deaths for their belief in the same God? It is the discord caused by the deceptions or ignorance of their spiritual and political leaders that inflame humanity against itself and condemns the messages of its prophets. As I study and compare the Islamic religion and the culture with my own, I find myself being drawn to a conclusion. That conclusion is the finite definition of my own faith. To believe in either Jesus or Muhammad, Moses or Buddha, or the many other divinely inspired men and women of great faith depends solely upon the individual. God's endless diversity can be understood more clearly simply by looking at our own surroundings. We have created our surroundings through the graces of God and His gift of nature. His laws, given by His prophets, state that if an individual's faith is derived from in his own evidence of the one true God, he or she will be indistinguishable from any of the prophets. He or she will have love and compassion for their fellow man. The prophets have taught us what we inherently know. Mankind must consider itself a marvelous and mysterious creation and must have a collective and unified faith in the compassionate omnipotence of the one true God if we hope to continue to exist. You can reread that on lastillshow.org. My next essay tonight is was inspired by the last words of Saddam Hussein before he was hung. And I was rather inspired by the look on his face. I saw the I saw the clip, but I basically saw the picture of his last moment, the last picture they showed of him, and a close-up of his face. And the stare that he had and the look that he had before he was hung rather spoke to me somehow, and kind of amazed me a bit. And I made it all real. Made the whole thing real to me. And I wanted to read this. His final words were, "Allah is great, the nation will be victorious, and Palestine is Arab." These were his final words that were reported in the press on the day of his death. And based on that, that's the title of my essay. Allah is great, the nation will be victorious, and Palestine is Arab. I watched the video clip released to the American media of Saddam Hussein's final moment before his execution. I was struck by the look of stern resolve in the face of Saddam Hussein as the hangman's noose was placed around his neck. His last words were muted out of the video clip, but the world was told that his final words were, "Allah is great, the nation will be victorious, and Palestine is Arab." I was moved by these final words of a man facing his last moment on earth. He did not cry out. He did not beg for his life. He did not curse his accusers, nor did he curse those who deposed him and brought him to the last moment of his life as he stood on the gallows. His sons were killed. The nation he built was destroyed and plundered, its museums and holy shrines defiled, the Islamic religion and the Prophet Muhammad humiliated and condemned by Iraq's conquerors. How old and sad is this story? As I watched, I witnessed Saddam Hussein's dignity and resolve as he faced the moment of his death. I was compelled to compare the cowardly and contemptible character of George W. Bush, the coward-in-chief of the barbarian hordes that brought ruin and genocide to the descendants of the world's most ancient civilization. I wondered what G.W. Bush and his henchmen Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and all the war criminals in the Bush administration, past and present, would do if they were face to face with the hangman's noose. What would their final words be? Regardless what sentiment anyone has towards Saddam Hussein, no one can deny, after witnessing the last moments of his life, that he faced death with dignity. His final stern stare and words were all that were needed for the world to understand this complex man. His death was noble. His resolve was courageous. His final act and words appeared to come from a man who knew that the final judgment of his soul would not be made by men. I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and in the second part of this program, we'll be discussing the Words of Mahummad by Dr. Khaseem Khaleel. And I hope you enjoy that. And please, in our third part of the program, we'll be introducing this book by Dr. Khaseem Khaleel, and this is Wrongly Blamed. And we'll get into that in the third program. So I want to thank you for joining us, and good night. LA Steel. Tonight is part two of of a two-part show that where I want to talk tonight about the Words of Mahummad and introduce you to a remarkable book called The Words of Mahummad by Dr. Khaseem Khaleel. And I've had this gentleman on my show a number of times, on my radio show, and fascinating scholar, medical doctor, and just a all-around brilliant man. And I learned a lot from his books, and I wanted to introduce that to you tonight. The Words of Mahummad. By the way, this what you see on the bottom of your screen is as the address for my internet talk show, which is on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Friday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard, and blogtalkradio.com/LASteelShow.org. I hope you tune in. It's an hour-long show, 8 to 9. Lila, my co-host, is with me, and it's an extension of our regular Q103 FM show that we do on Tuesday nights, but it's only an hour format. Tuesday nights is a 2-hour format, and it gives us a chance to cover the news as it's happening on a weekly basis. I have to be a little more selective, but as to what I can talk about and cover, because news happens every day and every hour, and it gives us a chance to talk about that, and also to bring to replay some of the great interviews that we've had with our guests, and it gives us a chance to be a little more diverse. And I want to thank everybody who has might be viewing this, who has tuned into our radio shows. But please note this one and tune into it. I hope you enjoy it. This quick essay is just an introduction. It's on my website, LASteelShow.org, and it's just it talks about this particular book. The Words of Mahummad. My Tuesday night radio show listeners were treated to a fascinating interview with Dr. Khaseem Khaleel about the latest book, The Words of Mahummad. This broadcast was replayed on my internet show program on Wednesday, 12/13/06, December 13th, 06. It can be heard from our archives, by the way, on blogtalkradio.com, LASteelShow.org, and it is also can be podcasted. Dr. Khaleel is an MD. He's a prolific writer and lecturer and has published over 20 books of various subjects on science and natural medicines, and scholarly works on the Quran and the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Another recent book by Dr. Khaleel is called Wrongly Blamed. It is a well-researched, controversial indictment of the Israeli intelligence agency, the Mossad. The book documents and explains their involvement in many of the most heinous terrorist plots of the 20th and 21st centuries. Our interview on Wrongly Blamed with Dr. Khaleel can also be heard on blogtalkradio.com/LASteelShow.org archives. As many of my readers know, I have been researching the Islamic culture and religion for most of a year. I have written several articles, and you can see them in my archives on LASteelShow.org, entitled Contemplating the Quran 1 and Contemplating the Quran 2. I have also written several more recent articles in November and December based on a deeper appreciation of the Islamic culture and the Quran, and a few this summer regarding Palestine and the Israeli war with Lebanon. It has been a true privilege for me to have Dr. Khaleel on my radio show to discuss the rich history and culture of the Islamic people. He has proven to me how the Western media, by their ignorance and deceit, have maligned and the remarkable religion and culture of Islam, and ignored the aggressive imperialistic attacks against the people of the Middle East. Western media has deliberately distorted the truth regarding the genocide and occupation of Palestine and the coups sponsored by the Western countries against lawful Islamic governments. Before my first reading of the Words of Mahummad, much of what I had been reading was from an older English translation and culturally biased Western writers. It became immediately apparent to me that we were obviously inferior. They were obviously inferior, rather, to this work by Dr. Khaleel. His language is clear, his syntax more precise, and his editor's notes and interpretive historical facts displayed throughout the book created for me a much broader and clearer understanding and appreciation of the extreme significance of the Prophet Muhammad and the Islamic culture have been to the advancement of humanity. Dr. Khaleel respectfully refers to the works of older and modern Jewish and Christian historians. I cannot recommend this book or its author more highly. The timely publishing of this work is a credit to the courage of Dr. Khaleel and the Knowledge House publishers who published the Words of Mahummad and wrongly blamed. The prophetic statements made by another courageous author captures the spirit of Dr. Khaleel's work. George Orwell wrote, "In times of universal deceit, to speak the truth is a revolutionary act." I am receiving no compensation for my recommendation of this book to my readers. The honor I receive is to all who read my writing and listen to my programs. So far has been sufficient for me to continue. I am urging all my readers, if you can avoid, or our listeners too, listeners and viewers, if you can afford to purchase a copy of the Words of Mahummad or Wrongly Blame or any of Dr. Khaleel's books, please do so. It will be the wisest and perhaps the best purchase you will have made this Christmas season. On my radio program, Dr. Khaleel states to my listeners that if he bought two, I'm not going to go into that on Access here, but I want to give you the phone number, and you can read this on my website as well, 1-800-295-3737, and their website is knowledgehousepublishers.com. If you're not convinced enough to buy these books, then please listen to the interviews with Dr. Khaleel anytime on blogtalkradio.com/LAStillShow.org. I can assure you that you will learn something new. And that's just I wrote this to promote this book because it's one of the most eye-opening that I've ever read. And I wanted to take some time tonight to just read a few excerpts from it. Something that, in Chapter 1 of this, which is entitled Islam and Christianity, Brotherly Faiths. This is an eye-opener for many, many people. And because most of us, as I say, I just started to read Islam, or I should say the Quran. I started with the Quran, and I found myself getting confused, and I found myself getting, we've been so mistaught, and to deny the sacredness of the Quran in the West. Chapter 1, Islam and Christianity, Brotherly Faiths. Islam is pro-Christianity. The Prophet Muhammad proclaimed that Jesus Christ is God's Spirit. The Quran says Jesus is the Messiah, documenting its virgin birth. It is the Quran which gives the Virgin Mary the highest status, that is, as God's dedicated servant, a kind of female prophet that only women mentioned in it by name. She's the only woman mentioned by name in the Quran. Jesus' mother. The basic teaching of Christianity and Islam are the same. These men, Jesus and Muhammad, are directly associated. In fact, they are colleagues in faith. Both are born in the same region, the Middle East. Both are exposed to the subtropical sun. Both were dark-complected. Regarding their lineage, they are directly related to Abraham, genetic brothers. Yet the man Muhammad, the only world leader in history to have held high the status of Christ as well as Mary, to call Jesus the Holy Spirit, this is who Christian authorities condemn as false. The Jews denigrate Christ, even accusing him of being an impostor. In contrast, the Quran gives him the highest status conceivable, as God's divinely inspired messenger. According to the Quran, rather than a Jew, he is a servant of God and his messenger. It claims him as human. Let me repeat that. According to the Quran, rather than a Jew, he is a servant of God and his messenger. It claims him as human. I'll go into this in a second. The Quran says that Jesus was infused with the essence of God. However, it disputes that he was his actual offspring. Rather, it says God is beyond any need for a physical son, and that, in fact, there is only one divine being. Thus, it disputes the human claim that Jesus is a God. Jesus cannot be God, says the Quran, because God created him from nothing, just as he created the first man, Adam, from mere dust. If God can create Adam from nothing, and the latter is never considered divine, then the creation of Jesus miraculously through the virgin birth is insufficient to claim divinity. Despite the high status, the Jews attempted to murder him. The Christians claim he was crucified. Muslims believe that he escaped and perhaps continued his mission. The powerful ones of this time sought to exile him and torture him. They deemed him a threat to their vastly corrupt financial interests. The fact is, he was a threat, but only to the arrogant, self-serving interests of the godless. He came to purge their devious practices. What more, he took direct action against them. Fiercely resisting them, they refused to adhere to any of his commands. It was the Jews who slandered Jesus. The Quran confirms their antagonistic nature, saying that they frequently killed prophets. In their scriptures, they avoided any mention of Jesus' greatness. Even today, in public forums, they refuse to acknowledge him, that is, as a bona fide representative of God. Thus, which one is the enemy? That is, of the Christian hierarchy, even of the so-called born-again movement. Islam, which recognizes, in fact, admires Jesus, or Judaism, which denies, rather despises him. Regarding Jesus, the Quran is replete with flattering messages, holding him in the highest esteem. In fact, it acclaims him as a dedicated servant of God. He is mentioned far more frequently than the Prophet Muhammad. Then who should the Christians fear? The imperialistic Jews, whose animosity toward Christ is incontestable? Or the Muslims, who deeply love him and who would say not even the slightest derogatory word against him? That is for fear of the absolute wrath of God. It's in the Quran. I mean, if people only understood their own religion, if they even read their own Bible, okay, they'd understand things. But, I'm sorry. Catholics, I mean, probably one of the biggest moments probably the biggest thing that ever happened to me was when I realized that I had a huge argument with my father over this. Fascinating. They were all Catholics and holy rule. My brother, my uncle was a priest and all this kind of stuff. But when my family told me they never read a Bible, that it wasn't right for them to read a Bible because only the church was supposed to interpret a Bible. Who are we to interpret a Bible? Well, you know, until you're about like 17, 18, 19 years old, you really don't care, you know, about what people are talking about, or you don't even care what religion you're in, basically, you know. But one year after that, you start thinking about how religion is affecting you, and how you're out there and you're learning things, and you're going to college, or you're going to, you know, you're working, and you realize that that either you're completely stupid, you should walk around, you know, in a cage somewhere, all right, or the rest of the world doesn't make any sense. Well, it dawns on you sooner or later. If anything that Muhammad does is he respects that quality in human beings. He respects that quality, but he says, and I want to quote some of these wonderful, wonderful words of his, and I'll continue. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let me go on. I want to. I'm going to skip past this particular one. The number one man. This chapter 2. This is regarding Muhammad and who he was. Regarding the Prophet Muhammad, there is nothing complex. In his own words, he was merely a servant of God. He stressed that he should never be treated as anyone superior, and he warned against anyone holding him high like a god, as happened to Jesus. He was a man, he told his followers, like all others. The Quran describes him as merely a messenger of God, like the previous ones. The truth about him is evident. It is found in his behavior, actions, deeds, methods, and achievements. It is found in the movements he created, which is described in the authoritative history books as revolutionary. His true nature can be found in his example, that is his refined bearing, his sophisticated manners, his profound speech, his higher purpose, his dignified stature, and his lofty goals. It is determined through his achievements, which are exclusively for the benefit of the human race. These include the origination of public education, which has an impact which is beyond measure. It is also found in his selflessness, in other words, his desire to truly serve his fellow man, even at his own expense. This man had no interest in personal gain. He sought no glory or wealth. His achievements proved that he was selfless. What's more, incredibly, during that dark pagan era when the concept of morality was unknown, he alone was the example of truth and justice. His accomplishments proved that he had single objective, the greater benefit of humankind. In the world, people are judged based upon their achievements. Regarding world leaders, they are judged on their true impact, whether positive or negative. This is also how this man must be judged. The fact is the great criteria. This judging based upon achievements must fit all. For this man, with such a criteria, there is only one conclusion. He receives the highest score of all. This is because his impact upon global civilization is so pervasive, so utterly vast, that it is beyond measure. For more information regarding the direct connection between him and the modern world, I have to it refers you to Science and Religion and Science in the Name of God, which are two other books that written by Dr. Khaleel. And I'll conclude with this statement. Initially, the Prophet's role was to awaken the Arabs to a worship of the one God. Prior to him, the Arabs had no idea what to worship. Generally, they bowed to idols. Their religion was based upon pride or ancestry. Whatever their forefathers did, they followed. Raw emotions were the source of their beliefs. They gave no thought to what they worshipped. But worshipping impotent objects, they could do as they pleased. but as they could continue to follow most loathed passions and vices, all they had to do was sacrifice to one idol, and any such deeds were forgiven, a kind of pagan atonement. It was only obvious objects which were adored: the sun, moon, stars, mountains, trees, stickmen, and rocks. Dozens of mini-gods were worshipped, and in fact they adored and worshipped the most crude man-made statues, what people today would find appalling. And the thought of an almighty God to which they were responsible was unknown. What more, people were largely uneducated. The refinements of civilization, sciences, arts, culture were non-existent. Yet the Arabs had a few redeeming graces. They loved life, and they lived it with gusto. They had developed a kind of code of honor, perhaps originating from ancient laws of Abraham due to the need for tribal loyalty. A man's word meant all, and people rarely violated this. After giving the word, the person held to it. People took pride in such an attitude, which is in fact still permeates the Middle East. Yet the pagan Arabs were rude and brash. Blood feuds, free sex, gambling, alcohol, rape, and murder were commonplace. A tough and hardy group, the Arabs lived under the most extreme of circumstances. No powerful civilization had any interest in them, and their world was too harsh to navigate. Thus, they remained free from outer influences. They had a freedom of thinking. In other words, they lacked preconceived notions. This made them ideal to receive a new message. It also made them virile, as they were the ideal conquerors. This was the harshest of all environments, and people were often poorly fed and thirsty. How a humanistic movement could have developed in such an oppressive environment is unfathomable. Here in the most inhospitable region of the world, a man arose with a universal message. This led to a global movement. It is a movement which has attracted over 1 billion people. What a dedicated man he was to create from this oppressive world such a far-reaching revolution. This was the real miracle of this man's message. And I'll continue tonight's show with those words. Please join us next week. For more, I think I'm going to go through a third part of this, number 3 of this book. And please join us at our website, at our website, and at our Blog Talk Radio show, blogtalkradio.com, lastillshow.org. And we'll be discussing this again in the next program. Thank you, and good night. Welcome to the Ellie Steele Show. Tonight's program is a third program in a series of In Defense of Islam. I hope you've seen the first two, but if you haven't, tonight's program is going to be centered around the works of a work by Dr. Khaseem Khaleel, and this particular book called Wrongly Blamed. Remarkable book in that it explains the false flag operations that we are being led to believe are Islam and Muslim in nature, like 9/11 and London bombings and the Bali bombings, and so much of what we know and hear on a mainstream media as Islamic and extremists, bombing us, and Osama bin Laden's and all this kind of stuff. When in reality, Dr. Khaleel has found that to be quite different, and that most of the terrorism that we are aware of in the 21st century, as well as in the 20th century, the majority of it was provoked and caused by the Israeli Mossad, and which is the Israeli intelligence agency, to divert attention away from their operation and to cast aspersions and cast fear and doubt and negativity on the Islamic world and on the Islamic culture, and demonize that culture. And I'm going to start with a couple of passages tonight by Wrongly Blamed. And I think probably the best place to start is at the beginning. And we're on the first chapter. And it starts off very well. The official conspiracy. The London and World Trade Center bombings were government operations. In other words, rather than foreign or Islamic attacks, these were self-attacks by the governments. This is made obvious by a careful analysis of the facts. Another possibility is attacks by a secret or supposedly allied government. Regardless, the attacks were plotted and perpetrated by non-Muslims, who need a rallying point for their corrupt policies. This backing could only be achieved through violence. Essentially, without incident, Muslims have lived as citizens in the West. What's more, they have done so for hundreds of years. Muslims were blamed for these attacks, which justifies then their slaughter. It justifies invasions of their lands. This is precisely the opposite of what the Muslims strive to achieve. Even before 9/11, the U.S. had planned invasions of several Muslim countries. Covert operations in Iraq and Afghanistan were already in place. To attack such countries overtly, the government needed a provocation. Thus, the terror attack could hardly be a coincidence. 9/11 led to immediate warfare, which is precisely the goal of Western powers. It is a proven fact that prior to these attacks, war had already been initiated by the West, with the U.S. and British Special Force teams being operational in Afghanistan. So rather than the catalyst, 9/11 was the disguise for a deliberate war plot. In London, prior to the bombings, immense pressure was placed by the authorities for a British withdrawal from Iraq. Then, suddenly, there occurred the tube and bus bombings. The pressure was eased. Yet, despite obvious plotting by the American government, the fact is the Israelis are also directly involved. At a minimum, the Israeli rulers knew about it and took numerous precautions. What more, fake terror acts are an Israeli specialty. In fact, according to Christopher Sykes, in his book Crossroads to Israel, rather than the Muslims, who have no such history, Public terror was invented instead by the Israelis. To gain their political goals, notes Sykes, Zionists are dependent upon terror. Their terror acts are used as a distraction. Even though the Israelis are the sources, they effectively blame others. The fabricated terror they commit is an assault on people's intelligence. Thus, people are being purposely misled about the real source of these crimes. The Israelis are constantly doing this. Their attempt to create fabricated al-Qaeda cells demonstrates the degree of aggression. This was even done in Palestine. It began with statements by the former Israeli head of state, Ariel Sharon, who, according to the BBC, said that al-Qaeda militants were using the occupied territory as staging grounds, and that we know that they are there. We know that they are in Lebanon, working closely with Hezbollah. Note the use of absolutes like we know. Conveniently, Hezbollah is Sharon's adversary, which defeats his forces in South Lebanon after a prolonged war. Michelle Steinberg and Hussein Askari write in their intelligence article, Mossad Exposed in Phony Palestine Al-Qaeda Caper, that the United States government has proof that Israel creates Al-Qaeda cells. Evidence of Israeli fabrications surfaced in December 2002 when Palestinian police held a press conference in the Gaza Strip to reveal the details. These revelations discounted the lies told by Sharon to justify murderous attacks on the Palestinian towns. Though indisputable evidence plus captured Israeli agents, the Palestinians have proven that the Al-Qaeda mentioned by Sharon was precisely his creation. The author notes that the Israelis had previously made dubious claims regarding a terror attack in Kenya, in which several Israelis died, attributing it to Al-Qaeda. Sharon's ministers went on an immediate propaganda rampage announcing worldwide revenge, even though authorities in Kenya denied the Al-Qaeda link. Incredibly, notes the authors, Foreign Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called the Kenya attacks a golden opportunity. That is, to conjoin the American so-called fight against terror with the war against the Palestinians. Yet this was a mere diversion. In fact, this is a deliberate attempt to confuse people. This is so that any atrocities committed by the Israelis are viewed as justifiable. It is as if to say, we are just responding to terror. Thus, any invasion or killing we do is justified. They are merely terrorists. They have created the false picture, and the majority of people accept it. What's more, this is precisely what the Israelis did. They brutally attacked entire populations, killing and maiming countless thousands of civilians while destroying people's homes and property. They were responding only to terror, they claimed. But this was mere lies. Thus, just as the Zionists planned through this strategy, there was no world outcry. In other words, in advance, they neutralized any opposition. Attack against the British Islamic or Zionist. Only the Israelis and their terrorist gangs have a history of attacking British interests. It is true that over the past 200 years, the British have invaded numerous Muslim countries, including Palestine, Iraq, and Iran. Yet in contrast to the Zionist reprisals by Muslims are rare. In this regard, the Muslims have been docile. What more, within England, they have clearly been a law-abiding community. So the question is, was Britain attacked by the Muslims or by Western elements, notably the Israelis? The British Secret Service is also capable of committing self-inflicting wounds. However, it is the Israelis who have the most flagrant history of civilian terror. They alone are the global experts in the bombing of civilian structures, including buses and trains. It was exclusively the Israelis, specifically Menachem Begin, the Irgun gang, which in 1948 blew up the British headquarters of Palestine. The headquarters was in Jerusalem, King David Hotel. which was utterly destroyed by terrorist bombs. An entire section of the building was obliterated, and people were buried alive under the rubble. The bombs were planted in the basement by Irgun terrorists dressed like Arabs. This resulted in the death of over 80 British soldiers, diplomats, and civilians. This terror act led to Britain's withdrawal from the region. It worked, didn't it? Again, the Zionists have the prior history of the destruction of public buildings. Thus, in any modern civilization bombing, in any modern civilian bombing, they alone would be the first consideration. Previously, Jewish thugs from various gangs assassinated British diplomats, including a 1944 Lord Moyen, a close friend of Churchill. Thus, during the World War II, Zionist terror squads were freely active. Yet Churchill was himself the main force behind the creation of the Jewish entity. Churchill was half Jewish. Regarding terror acts, Winston Churchill had a sordid history. Frequently, to achieve so-called political goals, he placed his fellow man at risk. He leaked intelligence to German agents that the passenger ship Lusitania carried weapons. This was a lie. As it neared the British coast, it entered a U-boat-infested region and was apparently sunk by the Germans. This forced the formerly reticent United States president into action. America joined the war. But he himself was part Jewish. Churchill vigorously pursued the Zionist agenda. Like other Zionists, he committed crimes against humanity to achieve his goals. His greatest crime was incitement to war. He did this largely with one goal in mind: the creation of a Jewish exodus. This was to forcibly populate Palestine. In this regard, it is important to remember a simple fact. It takes a monumental effort to forcibly displace a sovereign people, those who have existed in a region for countless centuries. Thus, the creation of the Israeli entity was truly a vast international crime, all achieved through a deliberate, malicious plan. In this, the dedicated Zionist Churchill played a predominant role. I highly recommend you read this chapter and get this book. This blew my mind, this particular one. Conspiracy to murder and crimes against humanity. Islam has been portrayed as a sponsor of terror. Media outlets proclaim it is the source of global instability. These are all lies sponsored by antagonistic elements which seek to undermine it. This has led people to make wild claims such as calling for the killing of all fundamentalist Muslims. Some have even promoted the extermination of all Muslims. Yet would such people propose the same if they determined that instead of the Muslim, it was the Jews who were responsible? Such individuals are ready to condemn Islam, or at least question its veracity as a true religion. Yet they base this on mere lies. Again, despite their vast history of committing terror, will people call for the extermination of all Zionists or for the destruction of Judaism? The Mexican Congress, absolute evidence. The attempted bombing of the Mexican Congress is an example of blatant Zionist tyranny. It proves that rather than Islam, it is Zionism that is the source of international terror. Zionism is exclusively political. It is originated by wealthy and prominent European Jews. This was to create a Jewish empire. Its purpose is the creation of a vast wealth and power. It has nothing to do with religion. Its avowed methods are to achieve wealth and power through any means possible, including the use of terror. In October 2001, in Mexico City, less than a month after the terror attack in New York City, a group of Israelis, in fact illegal immigrants, were caught attempting to commit a terror act. The operatives, which included a former Israeli defense colonel and presumed spy, were caught after penetrating security. These men had sufficient weapons to destroy the government offices. They possessed some 9 grenades, various explosives, detonators, and 9mm automatic pistols, firepower which was aimed at government officials as well as civilians. Authorities said that the Israeli terrorists took advantage of a situation where a large group of industry workers were attempting to go through security. The Israelis followed the workers through to the office of the President of the Mexican Congress, at which, at first, they pretended to be press photographers, but their agitated behavior alerted the suspicion of the workers. They were confronted, and it was discovered that they had guns as well as explosives. The workers held the Israelis until security personnel took them into custody. The head of the security confirmed that they possessed weapons of mass injury, including, incredibly, sticks of dynamite, rapid-fire handguns, wiring, and hand grenades. Due to only the alertness of the locals, an impending catastrophe was avoided. There was only one purpose to the dynamite and grenades. It was to blow the Mexican Congress into oblivion after slaughtering the innocent. Surely the Israelis had a plan where other faux agents dressed as Muslims would make a scene, creating the false image of Islamic terror. However, the plan was foiled. Only 1 month after 9/11, the Israelis were caught in the act. A disaster with global implications was averted. There was no doubt that this was an attempt to Israeli terror attack. The purpose was to punish the Mexicans for failing to support Israel's global tyranny. It is also to simultaneously implicate Islam as a sponsor of terror. Despite these obvious attempts to commit mass crimes, the Israelis were ultimately released. Unlike numerous innocent Muslims, they were never tortured. Rather, they were returned to the terrorist entity, Israel. What if these deviants would have been Muslims? The fact is, the type of punishment they would have endured can only be imagined. Surely, under no circumstances would they have been let go. The fact is, they would have been punished severely, perhaps executed. While heavily reported in Mexico, there was no U.S. coverage of this event. Again, if Muslims would have attempted this, the consequences would have been dire. The fact is that the Zionist-controlled press completely suppressed this event. In contrast, had Muslims been caught doing it, it would have been broadcast to the entire world. Just for example, the book goes on, and I have so many things, and we're not going to get to them tonight. But I hopefully I've read enough to pique your interest in this particular book. But before we close, I'd like to just read this segment. Types of terror acts invented by the Zionists. Now, these were the terror that we know today was actually invented by the Zionists in the 30s and 40s, in the 1930s, 1940s, when they were terrorizing Palestine to occupy it, illegally occupy it. The Zionists have employed every conceivable method of terror to achieve their goals. Previously, the actual European Jews committed the terror acts. This was a time when they committed clear acts of terror using obvious Zionists, that is, a light-skinned or European people. This proved scandalous and failed to serve their objectives. Then they created Arab and or Muslim-appearing individuals or groups, for instance, Abu Nidal, Islamic Jihad, even Al-Qaeda, to carry out their attacks. These names were used to maintain the image of Middle Easterners as Muslim terrorists. These groups are Western fabrications. No Muslims belong to any of them. The Israelis are ruthless. For instance, Yitzhak Shamir, a European Jew, mastered the science of letter bombs. In the 1960s, he used them to kill German scientists working in Egypt. Yet Shamir's main targets were Semites, that is, Middle Easterners. A partial list of the Zionist tools of terror include car bombs, truck bombs, roadside bombs, railroad bombs, bus bombs, bombing of refugees or civilian ships, bombing of high-rise or by placing bombs in the basement. Micro nukes, the so-called suitcase or dirty nuke, is essential essentially an Israeli invention, which is broadcast to create a derogatory image of Muslims. The injection into vulnerable regions of the body, nerve agents, strychnine, and similar immediate killers. Subterranean bombs, the bombing of industrial sites, poison gas, the injection of cancer-causing pathogens or biogerms. These terror devices were largely invented by the Zionists. Many were originally used in Palestine against the Muslim inhabitants, as well as the British. And the next chapter is large-scale terror acts and global shock, all perpetrated and proven to be Israeli-inspired. I highly, highly recommend this book, Wrongly Blamed. You may not agree with it, but it's very difficult to argue against the facts. And all you need is for somebody to bring it out. And Dr. Khaleel did. And I trust the man's work. I've had him on my radio show a number of times. And brilliant doctor. He's an MD. He's got 20 books. And you can go to knowledgehousepublishers.com and see the many books that he does have available. But particularly, I ask that you pick this one up. And don't forget, you might want to add this to your reading list, which is the Words of Mahummad. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. I hope you enjoyed the series. And please refer to blogtalkradio.com/LASteelShow.org. That's our on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Friday nights, in addition to our Tuesday night show on Q103 FM. But that is our Blog Talk Internet, exclusive to the Internet, blogtalkradio.com and /LASteelShow.org. Please go to my website. You can read some of the essays I wrote this evening, or in this series, and many more. There's several every week. And LASteelShow.org. And all this information will be up at the credits at the end of the show. I want to thank you again for my viewers who have followed this show for many years. I hope this disturbs you, this information you learned, and I hope it gives you a different perspective on the slander and the libel and the false flag concept, the false flag propaganda and false flag operations that are being provoked against the Islamic faith. And as you see, the barrage, the massive barrage of Israeli and Jewish propaganda out there now, and the Anti-Defamation League and all of this other stuff that's going on. They're putting billions of dollars into PR. In the recent, I've got articles to show that. And you can refer to my radio show again for a lot of this information at the bottom of your screen. I want to thank you very, very much for joining me, and I wish you the best of a very happy New Year, and good night.